Positive feedback. We should look for opportunities to give positive feedback to those who serve as our spiritual leaders. Here's Gene.
This is a very encouraging passage. 2 Corinthians 7, 4-7. Paul goes on now. He says, I have great confidence in you. Why? Well, he explains. I have great pride in you. Why? Well, he explains. I am filled with encouragement. Why? Well, he said, I'm overcome with joy in all our afflictions. Why? In fact, when we came into Macedonia, you see, Paul went to Troas from Ephesus. He thought he'd meet Titus there. Titus didn't show up, so he was disappointed. He went into Macedonia, crossed the Aegean Sea, probably went to Philippi. And he said, when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest. Instead, we were afflicted in every way. He was persecuted. Struggles on the outside, fears on the inside. But God, who comforts the humble, comforted us by the coming of Titus. Titus finally showed up. And I was just thinking about this in the age of email and cell phones and instant communication. I mean, Paul had to wait for months for encouragement to find out what was going on. Letters being delivered by hand, taking months, sometimes or weeks at least, to get there, and then to come back. And today I was in communication with a number of people, not in Texas, but in other parts of the United States, dealing with email and communications and dealing with issues instantaneously. That was not true for Paul. And so finally, here comes Titus. He thought he would meet him back there in Troas on the other side of the sea, but eventually Titus comes. And what happened? We were comforted not only by his coming, but also by the comfort he received from you. He said, Paul, you won't believe this. They really received me well, in spite of all the problems there. And he announced to us your deep longing, your sorrow. And here he's relating now specifically to the lost letter and to the issues that Paul addressed in that lost letter regarding that sinful individual. And we don't know what that sin was, but it was a serious deal. And he announced to us your deep longing, your sorrow, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. In other words, you're not mad at me. You took seriously what I said. You dealt with that sin, and I'm really rejoicing. Now, earlier, see, he spoke to that and said you need to forgive that individual. Now he's coming back. He's reflecting on the information that he got when Titus came. And then he incorporated that, of course, in the letter up front. But he had this positive feedback. And so he says, so even though I wrote to you, it was not because of the one who did wrong. That wasn't my only motivation. Or because of the one who was wronged. That gives us a clue that there was some kind of a very serious problem between someone who was wronged by someone who was wrong. And that's what Paul was dealing with. And this is what caused this incredible face-to-face confrontation, which was very painful. They didn't resolve it, and Paul said, I have to go back, but I'll come again. And then he decided, no, I'm not going to go. I'm going to write a letter instead because I don't want to increase the pain. That's when, of course, they accused him of being a wimp and being afraid to come. But he said, I wrote because of the one who was wrong, not because of that, but in order that your diligence for us might be made plain to you in the sight of God. He said, you proved to be faithful to that, and I'm so encouraged. For this reason, we have been comforted. In verse 16, I rejoice that I have complete confidence in you relative to that particular issue. Not in terms of all the other issues, but in terms of that particular issue. So Paul is really encouraged at this point. And so the question, reflection, response, in what specific ways can we offer positive feedback to our spiritual leaders today? I think this is something that we need to give thought to, because look how encouraged the Apostle Paul was. The encouragement is really especially meaningful when you're going through a tough time, when you're dealing with issues that are tough. But just generally, encouragement. I made a couple of calls today. Really, very honestly, one of the things that really precipitated my actions was reading this principle. And I thought, who can I encourage today? Now, it just so happened that I'm involved in a situation outside of the city of Dallas where there needs to be some real encouragement. And I made a couple of calls today, cell phone calls, email, and one of my primary purposes was to encourage, to give positive feedback in the midst of this situation. So I think all of us need to think about that in terms of particularly those who are in ministry, missionaries that we know about, pastors, spiritual leaders. We know they're going through some tough stuff. And boy, it's so meaningful. But just generally positive feedback. Had a wonderful experience today. Monty Brewer, who's with the Center for Church-Based Training, just got back from Vietnam. He's on the Center for Church-Based Training staff. He said, Gene, let me show you something. He said, I was in Da Nang, and he showed me these pictures of these Christians in this church. And then he brought up this picture, and right there, he said, this was right at the front of the church, a little book place, and there was the measure of a man in Vietnamese. I didn't even know it was translated into Vietnamese. I know it's been translated into many different languages, but I thought, isn't that amazing? A study I did years ago, put in writing years ago, back in the early 70s. Here it is in Vietnamese, being used by Christians in Vietnam. And by the way, God's doing some great things in Vietnam in terms of Christians. And do you think that was meaningful? Encouraging? You better believe it. And so you don't always have to have positive feedback in the midst of a difficult situation. It's just positive feedback that says, hey, God is using you. And all of you know people that God is using that could have a word of encouragement that would really maybe turn their night into day and help them to be really be encouraged. We can learn that because Paul was so encouraged by this feedback in the midst of his difficulty and concern. So let me just share the principle once again. We should look for opportunities. And if you don't look for the opportunities, you'll miss them because they're all over the place. We should look for opportunities to give positive feedback to those who serve as our spiritual leaders.